The first speaker is a very special friend, and he's someone I admire. The first time I met him, it was in Jakarta, in Keen ASEAN. And that was the first time I actually realized that one day I definitely want to get him to Bangladesh. So Professor Wilson, he just to give you a little introduction so you can get the full context of him. So I will give a little extended version of his introduction. He started working in advertising in London over 20 years ago. His areas of interest, as he calls them, are ABCD of business and culture: advertising, branding, communication, and digital. He has spoken at conferences across the globe on over 100 occasions and published over 200 pieces of work. He basically likes to assert that today, more than ever, brands have to take stand and articulate an authentic and credible positioning on race, religion, and politics. He has become skilled at bringing this thinking into a body of works that covers corporate identity, food, fashion, sport, tourism, music, technology, ethnicity, religion, and popular culture. Islamica 500 lists him as the top 50 global thought leaders for his work in Islamic economics, halal branding, and Muslim consumers. His papers on halal and Islamic branding have been the most widely cited globally for many years. His research on inconspicuous branded consumption and luxury appears in the Harvard Business Review and in the Journal of Marketing Management, where it received 2016 Best Paper Award. Notably, Professor Wilson works as a halal branding and marketing consultant to the Ministry of Tourism, Republic of Indonesia, editor-in-chief for the Journal of Islamic Marketing, an executive trainer for Al Jazeera Media Network in Qatar, an advisor to innovation and research from Stylus, and consultant to luxury fashion brand The Issue. In 2000, Professor Wilson converted to Islam and chose the name Bilal. So we can choose to call him both. So may I request Bilal to come on stage, and yeah, the stage is yours. Please give a big hand for Bilal.
It's on. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thanks very much for a good introduction. When I die, can you read that at my funeral? I almost died because it was quite long, but that's okay. And thanks very much to for the opening comments. I have to say that because I'm in a communications and advertising conference, when I heard discussions of we used to be outdoors guys, I thought of outdoor advertising and billboard advertising, but I guess we were talking about something else. So I can see people off in the future, off in the distance. Can you hear me at the back? You can hear me at the back. Okay, cool. So, as was rightly pointed out, you know who I am, and also, there's my presentation. I'll stand out of the way so you can see it. So, you can use my Twitter address, which is also Instagram, Dr. John Wilson, if you want to say things about me. And as you rightly pointed out, my name is Bilal, so one of the things I'd like to show you is that my logo, apart from saying JW, also reads Bilal. Now, why have I come to Bangladesh? And this is my first time in Bangladesh, which I'm really happy about. I kind of feel at home because I live in London, and in East London there's a big Bangladeshi population. Has anyone been to East London before? Okay, so you know that you've taken over East London, right? You own Whitechapel, you own Brick Lane, you know? So I was texting my Bangladeshi friends last night saying it's like being at home because I'm in this hotel and there are weddings and there are all of these things happening that I see in East London every day. So I feel at home. Now, the reason that I've come to Bangladesh, and I guess my mission is to ask this question. Time to make some great global Asian brands, right? Now, if there's one thing that I want you to think about, and this isn't a saying from anyone other than something I typed last night, right? Teach a woman to fish and we can solve a whole lot of problems. Now, why do I say that? Because I think we're in a really interesting time at the moment because there are lots of problems happening in the world. I mean, I switch on my phone when I got off the plane and I see that there are terrorist attacks in Spain. I switch on the television in the hotel and I see that there are problems in this part of the world. There are problems upon problems. And we're here today to talk about branding, to talk about advertising, to talk about communications. And I genuinely believe that we can solve a lot of problems through these channels that we spend every day working on. And I'll tell you why a little bit later. But I want you to think about this, and it's really important because if we think about this analogy of fishing and think about what fishing takes, does anyone fish in this room? Nobody fishes. Oh my goodness. So my father taught me to fish when I was quite young. So maybe some of these things will be lost on you. But for me, fishing is an art because you need patience. And you need to have your hook in the water, otherwise you're not going to catch anything. And you need to do a whole lot of other things that if you want to come fishing with me, then I can show you. But the adage of teaching somebody how to fish is really important because it's about self-sufficiency. And it's also about being one with nature. So if we're going to teach each other to fish, and especially I say teach women to fish, because if we think about the industry that we're in, still it's underrepresented. Underrepresented in terms of women, in terms of minorities, in terms of a whole lot of groups. But you could say that the biggest development over the past 12 months has been a lot more news coverage on the role of women in industry, the role of women in leadership, and also especially the role of women in the creative industry. So, I've come here to try and encourage us to unleash some lions. How are we going to do this thing that we would love to do? Because I want to ask you one question. So why do they come to us to make all of their products and services, and then they walk away with the top 100 global brands? So, when I say come to us, where do I mean? I mean Bangladesh, right? When I mean they, who do I mean? Well, who is this they? Now, when I looked at some of the top 100 global brands, 89 out of 100 are coming from Europe and North America. Of the 11 that are coming from Asia, you've got some from Japan, one from India, one from China, and some from Korea. None from Bangladesh. But if I look at a lot of my clothes, a lot of products, a lot of restaurants that I've been to around the world, everything is made in Bangladesh. So the thing that worries me, or the thing that I'm thinking about is, why does everybody come here for what used to be conventionally thought of as being the most important aspect of the business, the product and the service, and yet they walk away with 100 top global brands? And the brands are the things that help you make a lot more money than actually making that individual product or service itself. So we know why they come here, right? I don't need to answer that question. But the question that I want to stick on is, why do we let them walk away and create 100 top global brands? Well, I switched on the television this morning and I see Donald Trump yet again saying a whole lot of things. Every day he says something, right? So I want you to think that in terms of the landscape, we can't duck some of these very important issues. And what do I mean by reality just got really real? I really didn't think that a reality television star would really make it to president. Now, I remember when I went to Kinasian a few years ago, and I remember cracking a joke when Barack Obama was in government, and I said to the Americans, the fact that you took Saddam Hussein out of Iraq and then appointed a president with the middle name Hussein is insane. And I thought that was my joke's over, right? I thought, we won't have another president called Hussein that will be insane. It can't get any more interesting than that. Well, then we got this guy called Trump, right? A reality television star becomes president of the United States and is having a fundamental influence over many of our industries and how the world views us. So, if reality just got really real, and we can see the power of dreams and the power of television and the power of media, even to the extent that it can influence the appointment of the most powerful person, arguably, on the planet, why aren't we using this to our advantage? Well, it's not as black and white as you think. I need to check some things, right, so I can check my culture and vocabulary. You have chocolate in Bangladesh, right? You have coconuts, right? Do you use the term coconut or coconut or chocolate to mean anything else other than the food? Have you ever called somebody a chocolate Bangladeshi? Has anyone? Any hands raised? What do I mean? So if you came to London, if someone said, oh, he's a chocolate Bangladeshi, what would that mean? That would mean that when it gets hot, he melts. Right? He's not really around when it gets tough. The same, or do you have the term coconut, which is brown on the outside and white on the inside? Okay, so that one works in this country as well. Now, why do I say it's not as black and white as you think? Because I remember asking this question to my students a few years ago, where I said, is a zebra black with white stripes or white with black stripes? Now, it's interesting because then if you start to do your research, I found out that there are about 3 answers. One answer that used to be, well, it's a white animal with black stripes. And then more recently, zoologists suggested that actually, no, it's a black animal with white stripes. Why did they change their mind? Because like most of us, when you get older, your hair goes white. So it had to start off black, and then there was a loss of pigmentation, which meant that it became white in places. Now, the third answer for me is the most interesting. Anthropologists suggest that it depends on your state of mind. People from Africa see a black animal with white stripes. People from Europe see a white animal with black stripes. But interestingly, when I've come to Asia on several occasions and I've asked them the question without giving the answer, there are people that see it as a white animal with black stripes. And to them I say, well, you're a load of coconuts. Now, I'm joking, of course, right? But it's an insight into the legacy of colonialism, right? Do we have colonized minds? Is everything as black and white as we think it is? I'm going to argue that, based upon this example of the zebra, there are different ways to see the same beast. But if we're going to deal with this and we're going to cut through all of the black and white, how do we do it? Well, let's look at the invisible handcuffs. There are many things that prevent us from working effectively. There are many reasons why we can't do everything that we want to do. But I want you to think, do we also have invisible handcuffs? Even last night, I was talking to one of my friends, and can you imagine the worst thing that happens? He said, oh, a friend of his, because our A-level results came out a couple of days ago, so he said, oh, so-and-so's son didn't get into medical school because he didn't get the grades. And both of his parents are doctors, and they are distraught. He said, do you have any advice? I said, yeah, why doesn't he go and, I don't know, study halal and set up a halal certification body, and he'll probably make a lot more money and have a lot more fun. Because he can't, because he's a doctor. I said, yeah, I know. That's the Asian problem, right? What do you do when your son doesn't become a doctor? And I joked with him because actually, you know, on my father's side of the family, my white Scottish father, both of my grandparents were doctors. And none of their children, including my father, made it to becoming a doctor. They didn't want to. Actually, my father was a pathologist. And so my friend's response, he's Pakistani, was, yeah, but they're white. They don't understand what it's like to be Asian. And then I thought about it, and then I said, well, actually, my grandmother lived on a farm, and she was an orphan, and her older sister, who's 20 years older, brought her up. So then when I started to think about it, I thought, well, what stopped my gran? A woman with no parents, coming from a family of farmers who've never been to university before. Actually, nothing stopped her. And then I realized that if I took away that one word, white, then it probably would have made sense to everyone. You might have assumed, oh, well, she must have been African or Asian. She must have struggled. It must have been really hard for her. Actually, that one word changed the way that I see my family and other people see them and how they see themselves. So when we think about these invisible handcuffs, I want you to consider that perhaps there are many things that we do to ourselves that we should stop doing. Do we put restrictions on ourselves and say, well, it's because, you know, I'm a Muslim, I can't do this, or it's because in Asia we have a different way of doing things? I absolutely agree that there are restrictions, but should we investigate if all of them apply all of the time to every individual one of us? So, let's break some rules. If we're going to break some rules, one of them I'd like to break is the one based upon economic man. Why is it that we consider that humans are rational thinking beings? I give you money and you give me shatkara. Is that how it works? Well, according to economics, it's supposed to. That would then lead us to think about costs and benefits. But I actually like to look at the world in terms of risk and pleasure. Why do I look at the world in terms of risk and pleasure? Well, even let's replace the word risk with rizq, an Arabic word, an Islamic construct. Rizq shares a similar linguistic root to risk. And if I tell you a story about rizq and what it meant to the Muslim travelers, when they would do business, there was one example of a traveler who had 11 ships. 10 were shipwrecked. 1 succeeded in its journey and made enough money to cover all of the losses and profit. That was called faith. That was called rizq. That was called sustenance. That was called kismet. That was called all of those things that you probably understand. The idea is that you move forward and you have some kind of trust in the unknown. Now, if we think about rizq, it makes us think differently than risk, because risk always tends to make us think that we should reduce risk. And reducing risk often means not taking chances, right? Now, I spoke to this mufti and he started to say, well, why should you think of risk as sustenance? Because sustenance also suggests you're waiting for something to happen. Your hand is out there waiting for somebody else to change your fate. He said, it's luck. Now, if I asked you to go and find luck or to get lucky, how would you view that? Where would you go? Surely the key to being lucky or getting lucky is to get out there, is to meet more people, is to try things, is to actively try and influence your luck, your fate, your kismet, your rizq, right? Now, if we've got this idea of risk or rizq, and we look at pleasure, I'm going to give you another Islamic construct, which I think actually is really important when it comes to our industry. 3 levels of pleasure. Has anyone heard this before? Okay, neither had I until I'd met this gentleman. 3 levels of pleasure: physical, intellectual, and spiritual. So, here's a picture of me with Mustafa Sheric, who was the mufti who I interviewed. And he was a mufti in Bosnia for 20 years, over some of the very difficult times that we've seen in Bosnia. And he basically said that the difference between animals and humans is that animals eat, and this is only a physical pleasure. That's the difference. They understand one level of pleasure. For many of us, eating, we have an intellectual pleasure. It's not just the physical things that we enjoy of smelling, of touching, of eating, but there's an intellectual component attached, which is why you might want to buy Tom Ford as opposed to Yves Saint Laurent or something like this, right? So we derive an intellectual pleasure from physical objects and experiences. But the third and highest level of pleasure is a spiritual one. And the interesting thing about spiritual pleasure is you don't require any food. You don't even necessarily require intellect. But you can achieve the highest level of pleasure through spirituality. Now, the thing that I started to think about when I interviewed this sheikh, and I'm thinking about my day-to-day job, is how many products or services or things do I do at work on a day-to-day basis do I attempt to embed spiritual pleasure? Because if I could understand unlocking the secrets behind spiritual pleasure, then that would make human beings whole, right? That would mean that you hit all of the pleasure centers. It makes perfect business sense, intellectual sense, emotional sense, and spiritual sense. So, if we're going to do this, practically how do we do this? Well, one of the things I think that's developed is, when I studied marketing in the 90s, they would talk about a target audience. And a lot of the images that they would use were almost like shooting, right? As like a bow and arrow or something like that. You find a target and then you target that person. Or even worse, you could say, marketers were like big game hunters, right? They'd go into the jungle, they'd find these big animals, the consumers, and either you'd have them in a zoo or you'd have them on safari. But ultimately, there was a difference between us and all of those animals out there that buy the products and services that we're trying to get them to buy. Now, I think that that's changed because actually I think a better picture is basketball. Because if you think about the game of basketball, there are slam dunks, there are fast breaks, there are bounce passes, and this is really what advertising is about in the modern day. You can't do advertising without digital, without sales, without marketing, and you can't necessarily get straight to the basket to score the points, right? It requires teamwork. And if you are really into basketball, you realize that the same teams can play each other 5 times and the results will always be different. And you don't always beat the same team, even if you play them 2 days later or whatever. So the landscape is always changing. You need a game plan, and that game plan might not work all of the time, but you need to be on the field playing if we're going to get forward. So, what else has changed? Well, I spoke about America and Donald Trump. What's happening in the US? More people are using mobile phones and using them to access the internet. Asia, it's even more impressive because you've got more people accessing the internet than they have bank accounts. Now, but if we look to our friends across the water in America, look at how many people are using a phone in the toilet. Answering phone calls and answering the call of nature. One of the biggest behavioral developments that I think changed over the past 10 years, linked to the smartphone, is the way that people view the same scenario in a different way. How many people, when you go to a shopping mall or somewhere, do you see now doing stuff? And by doing stuff, I mean answering phone calls, sending text messages, sending not-so-good emails to their boss from a not-so-good place, right? Taking photographs in the toilet, taking photographs of food, you know, documenting every facet of their life, and they're doing it even in the toilet. I would even go so far as to say that there are people that take toilet breaks, not necessarily for the toilet, but just to get some privacy in a cubicle to make that lol or that emoji or something that they can't do at their desk. You know who you are. So, we have to understand this new reality of convergence towards this one glowing screen. And this converging us, not just in terms of our behavior, but also the way that we think. Because when I switch on Twitter, I've got all of the news headlines that I want to see because I'm linked to all of the people that I think like. But this is exactly the same for someone who's completely different to me. How do we break through to those other people who don't think like us, who don't live like us, who don't know people like us, who've maybe never seen someone like us before? Well, it's becoming more difficult, but one of the basic principles, I think, is the 80-20 rule, that in social media, I would argue that more companies need to be spending time evangelizing and saying good things about other people, which seems like a strange thing to do. Why are you going to spend your time and money sending 8 out of 10 tweets or likes or something, bigging up somebody else? But that's what social media is about. That's what you can do if you're going to play the game, right? If you're going to replicate reality, if we're going to try and garner human emotions, then we have to find a way which is beyond the conventional rules. We have to find a way to have a human aspect. We have to teach rather than preach, because you all know what you do, right? If somebody is preaching, we are the best, or, you know, you ignore, you delete, you unfollow, you unlike. So we have to also then think that whilst we're saying all of these things are here forever. Be very careful what we say, because it's around forever. So if it's around forever, on the positive aspect, you don't know when, but at some stage, that thing that you're doing can come back to life. Because it can be found. Because somebody somewhere will find a use for that content. But we have to be able to do it in dynamic, real time, all of the time. Or if you want to look at it another way, we have to put the spirit into our brands. We have to humanize them, and we have to engineer receiving. And we have to hope that we receive, rather than give in that we will receive. So, if we're going to get lucky, if we're going to be sociable, if we're going to say good things about people, more than we do about ourselves, how does that practically look? Well, we've still got problems. I put this slide up because if we think about how irrational human beings are, and I try to recreate this scenario, got this lady here saying, is he a scary Arab Muslim or a sexy Italian? What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if we think about the thought process, we've got a lady here that is afraid of Muslims, but she kind of thinks he's cute, and that makes her feel uncomfortable because she's not used to seeing a cute Muslim. So he can't be a Muslim, right? Or he can't be an Arab. He must be Italian because Italians are more attractive. This is a basic kind of explanation of something that we know of called cognitive dissonance. This idea that we try to make sense of things even if they're nonsense. Think of all of those examples where people go shopping. So I know people that buy shoes that don't fit them, right? You've probably met some too. That pair of shoes that's just so nice that they just try to squeeze their feet into and make excuses. Think, well, they might stretch or something. I don't know of many people that go on foot diets. I don't know of many people's feet that can change shape sufficiently to fit into a shoe that never fitted in the first place. But we see enough people doing these things. We see people trying to make sense of things because otherwise they are uncomfortable. So cognitive dissonance is about closing the gap and trying to make reality fit somebody's worldview. So, if you understand that, and you understand that people have different worldviews, and we have to try and find new ways to expose them to the real reality, how do we go about doing that? Well, that's not how you do it. Often you see this on the headlines, Muslims are terrorists. And often you see people respond by saying, Muslims are not terrorists. If I tell you that from a psychological perspective, the word not makes no difference. Actually, your brain works on associations. Now he's taking my picture so they'll see me as a Muslim, and the sign will say Muslims are. No, you can if you want, but everyone will think that I'm a terrorist. Because it works on association. Your brain somewhere is saying, but that word terrorist and Muslim keeps coming up, so there must be some relationship there. There must be something in it. So how do we overcome irrational, emotional thinking? How do we overcome the traps that are laid for us? Well, one way is transactional analysis, which is part of psychoanalysis. And I think this is something that we could do more to focus on. I'm going to argue that there are 5 different ways in which you can communicate the same message. Adult is in a neutral way with no real emotion. It's factually based. Parent is either nurturing or critical, and child is either free or adapted. So if I give you some examples, if I said to you, good morning everybody, today I'm going to talk about branding. That's kind of adult and neutral, right? If I said, listen very carefully, you people are always messing around with your phones. That's critical parent. If I am nurturing and I said, I know that we've all traveled so long, it's a Saturday, you're probably tired, you probably had a wedding last night and you'd much rather be in bed, nurturing parent. Adapted, well, Sharif told me that I have to talk about branding today, adapted child. Free child, let's learn branding. Right, so from that example, if we can learn 5 different ways of communicating the same message, then we have the tools that enable us to play the communication game. And the communication game is trying to control the narrative and the discussion. This works for brands too. If you think about some of the brands, like, maybe not the best example in a Muslim country, but Carlsberg, probably the best beer in the world. The word probably means that your brain can't do that. Well, according to who? Who says what? What do they know? Probably means, well, your brain goes, yeah, maybe it is, right? Nike, just do it, is a command. Now, what does that command mean? I don't know, but what I know is that if just do it is on the billboard and I'm on my way to work and you said, shall I have biryani for lunch? Just do it. Okay, Nike, I'm just going to do it. The internal dialogue is telling you to do something. So we need to work, I think, more effectively at understanding the building blocks of psychology and trying to communicate with people's unconscious and internal dialogue. So if we're going to do that, and we can do that 5 different ways, and not just the usual way, which is when we go on social media, we either become critical parent if somebody says something negative about our brand, or we avoid, or we become adapted child because we say, we're really sorry, but we can't do this at the moment. Do we actually try other modes of communication, like free child? Like, I remember one of the best examples where someone complained about a clothes brand, and they said, hey, we're doing our best. It's hard working for a job with not very much money and really trying to care. It was an honest response, and the person made excuses for them. So if we're going to change our style and tone, we're going to use branding to do it, because branding is the thing that makes our message super concentrated, because those are the meaning creators, the language shapers, and the game changers. Now, why do we need to get into this forum of Asians producing top brands? It's because you know it yourself. You have a pair of trainers or sneakers made in Bangladesh that cost $8 maybe. You put a logo on it and it sells for $100. Right? No logo, it's in the market for $16. No logo, no messaging, nothing. It's just a pair of trainers. You put a celebrity, you put a dream there, you put a logo, you put a campaign, and you've got $100. You've got $100, and it's a different playing field, right? You can invest in research and development. You can hire more talent. You can do whatever you want. But we need to get into this forum where we're not fighting over pence, but we start dealing with some of the global brands. So if we're going to do that, well, I think there are different recipes and style guides that we have to study. Now, this is one of the things that I kind of, if we had a day, I'd go through this. But essentially, it's about storytelling. Are we telling stories upon stories? Is there a structure? Is there an architecture? Are we engaging the five senses? Are we reminding people of those things? Because if you can do that, then you're embedded in culture. And if you can really do it as a global brand, it's not just that your brand is cultural, you start to shape culture. You start to influence culture. And that's why people talk about the American dream. That's why people buy Japanese and German cars, right? But not so long ago, made in Japan or made in Germany were reasons why you wouldn't buy, because of their politics and their foreign policy, right? The label was there to tell you not to consume. So the thing that I want us to consider is, how is it that nations that were ostracized so quickly have been able to repair their identity, their national identity, and link that to branding, and then that allows them to charge a premium? For you guys, for us, it should be quite easy, right? Imagine a scenario where made in Bangladesh is something of prestige, is a badge of honor. And then everything that you do, every word that you say, every holiday, every television show, every celebrity, every sportsman, people automatically assume that they're amazing, thanks to branding. So, here's a little example of something that I did fairly recently. I did some work for Indonesia. So they have a tourism campaign, Wonderful Indonesia. They have an airline, Garuda Indonesia. They have a Garuda as their flag. They asked me to look at trying to attract Muslim tourists using things like halal tourism, because they realized that whilst on paper it makes sense to appeal to the world and to try and get as many visitors, in these economic conditions, who do you think is more likely to spend their money in a Muslim country? Muslims. Who is less likely to be put off by some of these fear of attacks and things? Muslims. So the pennies finally dropped that actually, on our doorstep, our brothers and sisters, if we work together, can actually provide economic stability, right? And if you look at Muslims travel, then they travel in like 10s and 15s as opposed to Europeans that travel in 1s and 2s. So, how did I do it? One of the first things that I did, and I started writing on a piece of paper one night, was I looked at the bird for Indonesia, the Garuda, and then I worked with a calligrapher, and I drew this bird. If you can read Arabic, it says halal. So, messaging for me is really important. Just like I showed you my logo at the beginning, which says JW and Bilal, I want to put messages and symbols and meaning inside meaning. So I thought, can I do this bird and make it say halal? Because then if you can read Arabic, or if you understand that, then you understand that this logo has a meaning within a meaning. It's your culture, it's your symbol, and it's saying something which is halal, permissible. I then obviously had to make it fit within the identity of the overall campaign, and we have this thing called halal tourism. So we have the Garuda bird here that says halal. Now, it doesn't just stop there, because actually, if you're going to target Muslims, that doesn't then mean that I'm going around putting Arabic everywhere saying, you haladina amanu, assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, Ramadan Kareem, and lots of Arabic signaling. I actually then did the reverse and said to them, are there universal principles upon which you can send messages to people based upon segmentation? You don't actually have to say, are you a Muslim, come to Indonesia, right? The logo is there. So my segmentation was based upon the affinity groups and interests of people. One of the things that I argue when it comes to things like halal tourism or Muslim tourism is the most important thing for me is it centers around women. Because if you look at hotel facilities, they want maybe women-only spas. You know, there are lots of things, or segregated facilities. There are lots of things that actually center around women. Family being another thing as well, right? Do you have facilities for children? Is there childcare? Is there food? You know. So at the center of that, after all of the research, if it's about women, then those could be universal principles that apply regardless of religion. Which then means that if you want to market tourism and you can show that it's a safe destination and an enjoyable destination for women, the chances are that you will get a higher percentage of people interested and satisfied, and you will achieve your objectives. One of the most interesting segments, I think, is the one called PANKs, which is professional aunties and no kids. Do you have many in Bangladesh? Okay, see, in the West, I can show you, there's probably quite a few Bangladeshi women who fall into the category of professional aunties and no kids. It's one of the things that happens in the West, right? You focus on your career, you leave it a bit later, you've got a profession, could be married, but you don't have kids yet. Now, what is special about professional aunties with no kids? They spend so much money on everything, especially on their nieces and nephews. If I look at my own family, for example, my children's auntie will spend easily 5 times more money on clothes than I will, because to me, those are girls that are going to grow up very soon, right? To her, it's an Instagram picture. It's a lifestyle choice. My children are an accessory. Panks want to go on those experiential holidays so that they can say, look at me, I'm a hip and happening Asian Muslim girl skydiving, horse riding, eating food with cute kids wearing designer labels that aren't mine because I've still got my looks and all that kind of stuff. So the idea is that we think about segments based upon people's real needs, what really motivates them, what makes them tick, and ignore some of the basics like you're male, you're 24, you live in this region, because they don't really tell us how people think. And after all of that, working with some fashion designers, you know, when I interviewed them, the basic premise upon what they wanted to build was this. I want to make Muslim women feel proud of who they are, neither inferior nor superior, just their ultimate self with style and pleasing themselves. Now, if that was a statement from any other sector, you might think, well, that's not very hard, is it? But I think that it's a profound statement. If you think about the context of being a woman, being an Asian woman, and wanting to live her life, that basic need of wanting to please yourself and being neither inferior nor superior is a monumentous struggle, especially in the landscape of America, of Muslim bans, of all of these sorts of things. But at the heart, that was the spirit behind the campaign. Neither inferior nor superior. And the image that I put forward that I thought answers a lot of these questions is, and a husband took a picture of his wife surfing in Indonesia. Now, coming from Europe, there were all of these headlines about the burkini ban and all these sorts of things, right? And I thought, rather than engage in this, Muslims are not terrorists or this is somebody's choice, is show them a picture. Show them a picture. How can you argue with somebody having a good time? It's very hard. If you find the right picture and the right story, then I think that you can help to make things like halal unmissable, because often when we think about, if we go back to this idea of handcuffs and rules, prior to this you might have thought, well, what does halal mean? Halal means what is permissible. If you translate permissibility, how cool is permissibility? How sexy is permissibility? How enjoyable? How many times a day do you go up and think, all right, I'm just going to go up and have some permissible breakfast. I'm just going to have a permissible walk to work. I'm just going to make a permissible phone call. It's not very exciting, is it? So my job was to try and think about ways that we can make permissible unmissable. And the key to that is basically to change the narrative, to change the stories, to change the images, and to get people to think on a deeper level. So, to kind of wrap up, I think it's important that we grab attention. You have to learn how to grab attention, and grabbing attention also means disrupting existing behavioral norms. If you simply serve behavioral norms, then you're going to be instantly forgettable. Disruption is really important. And keep disrupting. Because if you disrupt somebody once, then they take notice, and then they go back within their comfort zone. Again and again and again, disrupt behavioral norms. And then after a while, you get a reputation for being disruptive. And being disruptive can only be a good thing in the branding space. That's me for now, and I'd like to leave with this message. So if we're going to do this, just remember, in the world of social media, as far as I can see on Instagram or whatever, every street is a catwalk and everyone is a celebrity. So let's try and harness the power of social media and find ways to allow and to encourage people to be part of the brand, to live the brand, and that also means encouraging them to co-create, which is a strange thing if you work in the communications industry and it's about control. The reality is, we can't control everything. There are lots of things out there that are outside of our control, but we can work with people, we can engineer situations where everybody feels part of a community. Have you taken your picture? Okay. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and obviously exchanging business cards and taking selfies. I've done research on selfies. I found out that ugly faces get you more likes on social media, so let's pull some ugly faces. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bilal. That was very. Please, if you can just stay here for a while. Do you have any questions? I mean, we do have hashtags, but if anyone wants to stand and ask any questions, so please do that. But while that's happening, I'd like to ask a couple of from mine. So, you have been in London. You have been interacting with the Bangladeshi community in East London. So, if I start from there, in your interaction with the Bangladeshi communities and your interaction, which is not Bangladeshi communities in London. From a creative, because that's what we will try to look at, explore more and more. I think this gives a very nice context, because when you talk about disruption, I think that's where it comes. How do how do you make it permissible? How do you expand the definition of how we look at it? And that's where I think the creative side of us comes into play. So anything that you think are a little bit more noticeable from the Bangladeshi community, anything that pops into your mind? There.
Okay, so as if by luck, right? There are two logos on my slide. You saw Dragonfly Black and my name JW Bilal, right? I can say that the designer that works with me on those is Bangladeshi. So I mean, he's one example. Ru is someone that's from like East London. He's a Bangladeshi designer. He studied at art college and went to Cairo and learned Arabic calligraphy. I have to say that I think the challenge is, if you're in a minority, a lot of the time we're having to kind of be pathfinders, and that's really hard. So one of the things that you can see is this: if you are going to be a pathfinder, people tend to want to go for where they think is going to make the most impact, right? So the Bangladeshi community. If I look in politics, there are people that are pushing through in politics. Obviously, medicine is another one that people do. But in the creative industry, it's still there is a tension. I know lots of great Bangladeshi creatives, but they essentially, a lot of the time, they have to set up their own firm. And that's hard, right? Because then you don't have the might of a big agency with their money base. You can't make mistakes with somebody else's money. But I think one of the challenges is, in the absence of role models, how do you push through? And it's that handcuff thing, because on one level you could argue it doesn't matter that there aren't key players in the industry that you can look up to, because people are just people, right? But if we know the reality, how do you feel when you wake up every day and you don't see people that look like you succeeding? that is really hard. That really gets at your internal spirit and stuff. So actually, like in London, I will have I've actually had a lot of Bangladeshi students that have studied advertising and branding with me. And then when they graduate, there are so few that actually stay in the creative industry. And I keep in touch with them. Like I emailed a lot of them saying, hey, I'm going to the motherland, like, you know. So they were like surprised, like, you're really going to Bangladesh? Like, I'm really going to Bangladesh. But then if I look at a lot of their LinkedIn profiles, you know, they will get a degree in advertising and then become a nursery nurse or become a school teacher or work in IT or something like that. Now, I'm not saying that those are not good jobs, but it's a real shame that having worked with, like, you know, spend 3 years with somebody and see their passion for creativity and advertising, and then when you ask them, so why didn't you, like, follow it through? You have the degree, you've got the expertise. I know that you could kill it in the marketplace, but there's this kind of killer instinct or this kind of burning obsession and desire to stick at it is really difficult, and I think that's where we need more support. We just need more people telling you can do it, because essentially, you know, it's this thing about risk as well. No one wants to fail, right? You don't want to feel like you've wasted your time, and especially if you're within a community where, you know, you tell people, like, you work in advertising, they go like, well, what is that? Is that a job? Do you need a brain to do advertising? Like, you know, I thought it kind of took care of itself. So I think that we've got some kind of internal community issues that we need to address. And for those people that want to do it, then we have to support each other. And that means on a continual basis.
One of the very important things, especially from creative space, is being discussed is the culture. So basically, we talk about the culture. Actually, if we create things which are born out of the culture, if we can really identify the nuggets of the culture that talks about, and basically bring this in whatever expression you are trying to create, whether it's a 5-second video to a film, it connects with you more. Now, in a time when actually many people who are coming into the, let's say, not the advertising space, but marketing and extended business space, for them, they are exposed to the global communication inputs much more than local context. And at times that begins to sort of influence the thinking. And do you think the challenge is then they begin to lose the relevance of the culture, they begin to miss out that small things and maybe define them, as you very rightly said, of the group that the circle, they maintain within the Facebook group. And somehow that becomes the world, that becomes the Bangladesh, where actually it's a very small portion of it. So how do you, what are your thoughts that how can we help people understand the culture? Because it's an individual journey. It's not possible for us to just push. This is the culture, understand it, study it, and apply it. So how do you think that in this very changing space, we get connected to the culture and that influences our work?
So I guess the challenge is that with globalization and there seeming to be so much information, so many cultures, do we lose the art of being an expert? And I think it's really important that we maintain a sense of that, you know, there are aspects of my personality where I'm a nerd. Like, I like culture, and I learn about some cultures in an obsessive way. I mean, I told you about the zebra. I don't know many people that kind of, that thought goes in the head and out the head. But like, for me, it was like I spent hours and days obsessed with, well, what is the right answer, or are there many answers? And so similarly with culture, like, and you would have heard me, I said Shatkara, right? How many foreigners do you get coming to Bangladesh talking about Shatkara in a branding conference? Yeah, well, there you go. So the thing is that I think that nerdy obsession to go into detail is essential if you want to produce global or local campaigns. So if you're a creative, you can't know everything, but you should have a really nerdy, deep knowledge of particular aspects of culture, and that becomes your signature, that becomes your calling card, right? So if you lose that, then you lose adverts that are really going to resonate. I think all of the amazing people that I've worked with who are creatives, there is something that they are obsessed with, and it's that obsession that leads them to raise standards and quality so that nobody else can challenge them in that area. And if you get good enough over time, that obsession for quality developed through one particular aspect can be transferred into something else. So if you become a nerd about, say, let's say, you know, Bangladeshi culture, then equally you probably would develop an appetite to become nerdy about Chinese culture in the same way, or Italian culture, and then you can keep on that journey. And I think that's really important.
Any questions? Anyone wants to ask anything to Jonathan? Of course, he's there for the whole day.
Come on, ask me a difficult question. It's free. After tomorrow, I'll invoice you.
Yeah, I guess they will. Oh, okay, here. Can you just give a microphone there, please?
Thank you. And thank you for coming to Bangladesh. And just one, I'm thinking about 100 best brand. But is it for Bangladesh, any company, going that level is very difficult. But where we can start? How can we start thinking that way and can reach to be in one of the 100 brand organization in the world? Thank you.
So one way that you could be in the 100 is to change the rules of the 100, right? So actually, you know, if we had, I could also argue, who cares about the top 100 global brands, right? It's irrelevant. If we made our own category of like what a great brand is, then you suddenly win, right? So yeah, I wrote an article on this, and actually it wasn't just the brands. I started to look at the top 50 marketing professors in the world, and guess what? Most of them are white and American, right? We've got some women. How many Asians? You might have like 1 or 2 Indian professors, 1 or 2 Chinese, no Africans, no Bangladeshis, no like. So what's the future for me? Does that mean that do I have to try harder to become like that? I think I just change the rules. Change the rules as to what it means to be a marketing professor. And you know, we met in Indonesia, and there are lots of examples where that kind of happens. So I'd say if Bangladesh is going to move forward, there's some soul searching where we decide what are the building blocks to what we believe would make a great brand. And then you have to evangelize about that message. And then, because now if we think other nations, like if someone says, oh, Japanese brands, you have an understanding as to what you think a good Japanese brand is. And that's different than the American rules of branding, right? Because American brands are created very differently than Japanese brands. Sony is a very good example of a company that had to create names in order to have their brand being great. Because before the Walkman, we didn't know that we could walk and listen to music with headphones and have this cassette player. But they had to come up with the name of the Walkman, the concept, they have to show people. And then they had to think, oh, and by the way, it's by a Japanese company and it's made in Japan, and Japan means good quality. So there's an intricate number of layers, but nation branding would help, right? Finding a way that we get people to evoke feelings, positive feelings of excellence and quality linked to Bangladesh. And that should be straightforward because, as I mentioned, you know, Bangladesh is making all of the most high quality products and services in the world. But Bangladesh is not claiming the responsibility, is not evangelizing, is not celebrating the fact and saying, well, do you know what? This brand would be nothing without us. It's us that's doing this. If step one is to increase the national brand identity and to claim that space to say Bangladesh is bloody great or whatever, you know, maybe don't say bloody great, but very English thing to say. But if you can claim that space and then continue to do so, you eventually develop excellence within different communities, and then you can reach critical mass. So you could think like, you know, take your neighbors. Out of the neighbors, like, you know, who's better? So it's almost like having a World Cup of cricket or something, right? Bangladesh has got to go and compete. Bangladesh has got to establish the rules, has got to say what those rules are, and create a brand that owns and claims that space. And within that, companies have to do that. And then eventually, the world will take notice. But you don't need the entire world to take notice, just enough people. Just enough key markets, which then mean that you can charge a little bit more. And if you can charge a little bit more, it makes a massive difference in how you can run businesses. Then you can start to focus on more quality, more excellence, more research and development. And I think also connecting with kind of the diaspora in other parts of the world. So I would say, you know, get those London Bangladeshis to come back home and to kind of invest some time in trying to make some great Bangladeshi brands rather than buying some land, you know?
Yeah, one final note. I always thought that I think you would be able to sort of give more specifics, but I think the overall global Islamic economy is around $2.3 trillion. And do you think Bangladesh has got a big space there? We haven't leveraged at all. It's almost zero. And do you think that's a space which we should also approach? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think definitely, because if we look, You know, Dubai is doing a lot, and obviously Malaysia is doing a lot. But it makes sense that in the same reasons that I was doing tourism for Indonesia, you know, this is a community, and there is the Muslim world, and the Muslim world is full of great hookups and connections. And this is a quick win, basically, right? Because you've got people who are going to be more inclined towards that message, that community, that promise, that trust, and that reputation. So start within the Muslim world. It makes perfect business sense. But Bangladesh currently isn't doing much at all in that space, which then goes back to the fact that if you're making all of the products and services that serve the rest of the world, and halal now doesn't just mean meat, it means like processed food, it means fashion, it means tourism, it means finance. There are so many different aspects to entertainment and media. Yeah, it's a missed opportunity. I'd say let's get busy and do something.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and we'll be hearing from you again soon. Please give a big hand for Jonathan. Now we're going to